Under a scorching Texas sun, a group of young German women stepped off a rickety army bus and into a scene they could hardly process. Dust swirled at their boots. Stetson hats bobbed in the distance, and there, amid the backdrop of open plains and wooden barns, stood American cowboys. Not with ropes or rifles, but with flowers in hand. These weren't prison guards. These were suitors, husbands. The women had braced for humiliation, punishment, the long echo of war. But instead, they found themselves in white borrowed dresses, whispering vows in broken English beside men who smelled of saddle leather and tobacco. One bride, her hands trembling, looked her new husband in the eye and said softly, "I do," unsure if she believed it. The witnesses cheered. The moment felt impossible. The church was small, barely more than a wooden chapel with open windows that let in the dry wind and the scent of hay. Outside, a horse pawed the ground impatiently, its reins tied loosely to a fence post. Inside, the pews creaked beneath townsfolk, who had gathered not out of malice or mockery, but simple curiosity. The sight before them was something the war had not prepared anyone for. German women in modest white dresses, cowboys in clean shirts and polished boots, a priest whose voice cracked as he spoke of forgiveness and new beginnings. The air was thick with disbelief. Some of the brides' faces were still drawn with fear. Others glowed with cautious wonder. They had spent years expecting cruelty, and yet here they were, given rings instead of rations, tenderness instead of torment. One woman, Greta from Hamburg, felt her knees shake as the cowboy beside her, a man named Samuel, reached out and took her hand. His touch was gentle, unsure, as if he too feared breaking something fragile. He had fought in France, she learned later, but in that moment, he was only a man trying to calm a trembling stranger. When the priest told him to repeat the words, "to have and to hold," his voice wavered, roughened by dust and nerves. Greta barely understood the phrases, but she recognized the tone. It was the sound of someone choosing peace after too much war. The vows passed like a dream. Each word felt foreign and sacred at once. The brides repeated what they could, their accents heavy, their eyes flicking to one another for reassurance. Some smiled awkwardly, others swallowed tears. When the ceremony ended, the men lifted their hats, and the crowd clapped softly. Not in mockery, but in a kind of reverent awe. For a heartbeat, the noise of the world seemed to stop. The women who had crossed oceans in fear and shame now stood in the open sunlight with gold bands circling their fingers. They did not yet know what kind of life awaited them beyond the chapel, but the moment itself felt unreal, like waking from a nightmare into a world too quiet to trust. Outside, the cowboys led their new brides into the open air, where a few local women had prepared a table of food: cornbread, coffee, sliced peaches. The German brides hesitated before taking a bite, still half expecting a trick. But when they tasted the sweetness of the fruit, some began to laugh through their tears. It was the first laughter many of them had known in years. The cowboys watched with awkward smiles, unsure whether to comfort or simply stand by. These were men raised on hard work and harder silences, and they found themselves suddenly married to women whose worlds had collapsed only months earlier. They could see it in the way the brides flinched at loud sounds, in the way they folded napkins with military precision, in how they kept scanning the horizon as if searching for danger. As the afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the fields, the sound of a fiddle began to play from somewhere near the barn. One of the locals had brought it, meaning only to fill the silence, but the music took on a life of its own. The brides stood uncertainly, then one by one began to sway, their shoes kicking up dust. The cowboys joined in, hesitant at first, then laughing, spinning their wives clumsily in the open yard. It was absurd and beautiful all at once. Former enemies dancing beneath a sky the color of fire. For a brief moment, the war seemed impossibly far away. As twilight deepened, the priest blessed them one final time, and the crowd began to disperse. The brides gathered their small suitcases, filled with meager belongings: a brush, a folded letter, a single photograph of home. Their husbands helped them onto wagons that would carry them toward new lives scattered across the Texas plains. Greta sat beside Samuel, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the last light fade across the horizon. She did not speak. She could not. Somewhere deep within, disbelief and hope wrestled for space. The war had stolen her faith in humanity, and yet tonight, beneath the endless American sky, a quiet thought flickered to life. Perhaps survival could mean more than merely living. Their journey to that moment had not begun with flowers or music, but with handcuffs, orders barked in broken accents, and the bitter steel of surrender. Just months earlier, the women now called brides had been forced into trucks and marched toward an uncertain fate. Many had been clerks, nurses, radar assistants, women trained not for battle, but for bureaucracy. Some had served at field hospitals near the Rhine. Others had relayed coded messages in bunkers now buried beneath rubble. None of them had expected to be rounded up like cattle after the German collapse. As the Reich fell to ash and ruin, the women were taken, not to be celebrated, not even to be judged, but simply gathered and processed like debris from a crumbling empire. At makeshift detention points scattered across Europe, they were interrogated, fingerprinted, and told nothing of their destination. When the orders came, they boarded trains bound for Western ports. Through the cracked windows, they saw land they no longer recognized. Charred villages, weeping mothers, barefoot children digging through brick dust for scraps. Their country was gone. The surrender was official. But inside, the war had not ended. At Le Havre and Cherbourg, ships awaited beneath gray skies, flying flags they'd only seen on enemy leaflets. American soldiers herded them toward the gangways without shouting, without smiles. The silence unnerved the women more than rage might have. They expected to be mocked, beaten, spat upon. Instead, they were counted, tagged, and ushered below deck like livestock. The holds were dark, damp, and crowded. Metal bunks were stacked like cages. Some women retched from the smell of diesel and seawater. Others simply sat, staring at nothing, holding rosaries or scraps of paper from home. One woman from Dusseldorf whispered, "We're being taken to the desert. They will make us dig until we die." Another shook her head. "No, they'll parade us naked in their cities like trophies." Rumors bred feverishly in the stale air. That Americans liked to shave prisoners' heads, that they used women for medical experiments. That mercy was a lie. The ship pitched violently as it crossed the Atlantic. Days and nights blurred. Meals were handed out on metal trays, the food strangely bland but generous. Eggs, meat, white bread. A few women refused to eat, suspecting poison. One woman sobbed after tasting a slice of pear. "It tastes like the old world," she said, then folded her arms and refused another bite. They drank the coffee in silence, waiting for it to turn to ash in their mouths. But it never did. The guards kept to themselves, speaking in English that sounded more curious than cruel. Some women noticed the way they held doors open. Others overheard apologies when a tray was dropped. It was wrong. It had to be a trick. When the ship finally docked, in Boston, in New Orleans, in ports whose names meant nothing to the women, they were met not with screams, but with paperwork, customs officers with pens instead of bayonets. One woman clutched her coat so tightly her knuckles turned white. A soldier approached and asked if she needed water. She flinched. He stepped back, eyes wide, and muttered, "Sorry, Bryna, ma'am." The word ma'am fell like a stone in her chest. It was the first time in years she had been called anything but a number. They were loaded onto buses, bound for inland camps that sounded like fiction. Georgia, Texas, Oklahoma. Names from old westerns and Allied propaganda reels. Through the windows, they watched as landscapes turned from coastlines to plains, from cities to open stretches of green and sky. Cattle grazed. Children rode bicycles. Some towns had banners that read, "Welcome home, boys." And yet no one pointed, no one jeered. It felt like a movie set, too clean to be real. At the gates of Fort Reno, the women were told to undress for delousing. They braced themselves for humiliation. Instead, they were handed soap. Real soap, fragrant and heavy, followed by warm towels and clean garments. The water ran hot, not scalding. No guards laughed. No one watched. One woman wept so hard in the shower she collapsed, her knees hitting the tile with a hollow slap. Another washed her hair 3 times, just to make sure it wasn't a trick. When they emerged clean and shaking, they looked at each other as if seeing strangers. In the mess hall, the food was rich and plentiful. Some women picked at it in silence. Others devoured it like wolves. Still, none understood why. Why the kindness? Why the decency? One whispered, "They want something. They must." But the weeks passed, and the cruelty never came. Instead, the cowboys did. First glimpsed behind fences, leaning on trucks, their eyes scanning the camp with a mixture of caution and curiosity. And for the first time, the German women began to realize, perhaps this was not captivity at all. Perhaps this was the beginning of something even more dangerous. Being seen. At Fort Reno and Camp Huntsville, the walls were tall and the wire was real, but what waited inside was not punishment. It was order, silence, and something worse than fear, consideration. The guards didn't bark commands. They handed out blankets, directed the women to clean bunks, and offered instructions in voices too soft to trust. One woman was led to a small infirmary after coughing during roll call. She prepared herself for isolation, for interrogation. Instead, a nurse with red lipstick and an Oklahoma accent gave her tea and checked her lungs. "You're underfed," the nurse said, almost kindly, as if the word wasn't a sentence. The woman stared at her, unsure if kindness could exist without a price. Another girl, barely 19, dropped her tray in the mess hall out of sheer panic. A soldier knelt to help her pick it up. She recoiled. He paused, hands raised in surrender, and said, "Ain't no shame in nerves, miss." That word again, miss. She wasn't sure if it was meant to wound or comfort. Their names were written on neat lists, their temperatures taken. They were weighed and measured and placed in wooden barracks, painted a dull tan. The walls were thin, the cots narrow, but the sheets were clean. Some women touched the blankets over and over, like they were hallucinating. One muttered, "Why give us this? What game is this?" But no game ever came. The guards walked past with indifferent glances. Some tipped their hats. Others offered awkward smiles. It wasn't welcome, but it wasn't cruelty either. It was something disorienting. Meals were the next insult. Hot food, meat, eggs, bread so white and soft it dissolved on the tongue. A woman named Ilsa sat down with a full plate and refused to eat. "This is humiliation," she whispered. "They want to fatten us before the spectacle." But after a minute, her hand trembled, and she took a bite. And another. Her eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. Beside her, another woman crossed herself. "It tastes like lies," she murmured. But she ate too. The strangest gift of all came not from a guard, but from a chaplain. A small German-language Bible placed quietly on a bunk. No name, no comment, just left like a question. One woman clutched it to her chest and wept. She had buried her father with a Bible like that. Another was handed a chocolate bar during laundry duty. She held it like an unexploded grenade, unsure whether to unwrap it or scream. That night, she licked the foil for traces of sweetness before hiding the rest in her boot. None of it made sense, and that was what broke them. Had they been beaten, mocked, paraded through streets, it would have made sense. But this quiet routine of decency, it peeled away the armor built over years. Some women became angry, snapping at guards, picking fights with each other. Better rage than confusion. Better blame than the gnawing silence of doubt. The Reich had taught them who the enemy was, but the enemy wasn't cooperating. At night, they lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams and listening to the sounds outside. Crickets, the shuffle of boots, distant jazz from a radio. It was too quiet, too peaceful. One woman whispered, "I dreamed of bread and a warm bed. Now I have it, and I feel hollow." The others didn't answer. There was nothing to say. By the way, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from. Leave a comment below and let us know. These stories connect us across time and place. And if you're finding this journey meaningful, please tap the like button and hit subscribe below the video. It helps us keep bringing you these forgotten pieces of history. In the mornings, the women lined up for chores, laundry, kitchen duty, vegetable peeling. The tasks were dull but honest, and with each passing day, something inside them softened and rebelled all at once. It was not freedom, but it was not the cage they expected either. One guard passed by a group of women hanging linens and tipped his hat. "Fine weather," he said. One woman nodded before she could stop herself. Afterwards, she sat behind the barracks and cried. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had nodded and meant it. The first time the women saw the Cowboys, they mistook them for guards out of uniform. They stood just beyond the fence line, leaning on pickup trucks, hats tilted low over sunburnt brows, dust clinging to their jeans. Their eyes were shaded, unreadable, and their posture held the ease of men who live by the rhythm of land and weather. Some of the German women turned away immediately, suspicious. Others watched in silence, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. These weren't the soldiers who had marched them through ports. These weren't the guards with clipboards and boots. These were civilians. One even had a bouquet of flowers in his hands. Awkward, slightly wilted, but real. Rumors spread fast. "They're scouting us," one woman hissed, "like livestock." Another scoffed, "No, they're just farmers who got curious." But neither explanation fit. The truth came slowly. These were American ranchers and small-town men, some former GIs, some too old or too young for war, who had volunteered through church groups or local programs to meet the German women brought stateside as displaced persons, laborers, or potential brides. For the women, the idea was laughable at first. Marriage, after everything, to a cowboy. But curiosity proved contagious. They watched as the men approached the edge of the camp, always staying behind the boundary, always respectful. One brought a letter from a cousin in Oklahoma who had married a French girl. Another simply stood with a book under his arm, a German-English dictionary, flipping pages slowly like a man trying to learn a new language, one word at a time. The conversations, when they happened, were stilted. A cowboy named Eli tried to ask one of the women if she liked music, but his question came out garbled with nerves and twang. She didn't understand the words, but she smiled at the way he scratched the back of his neck and looked at his boots. That evening, she told the others, "He's not like the ones who bombed us." It was a quiet confession, met with silence. Tension hung over the fence line like heat rising from the ground. The women didn't know whether to be afraid or amused. Some laughed behind cupped hands. Others grew cold and distant. They didn't trust American kindness. Not yet. But over time, the strange visits became routine. A man would arrive with a carton of cigarettes, offering them to the guards with a shrug, then standing nearby as if just enjoying the afternoon. Another brought his dog, a border collie with soft eyes, and let it sit at the edge of the wire, wagging its tail while the women watched, uncertain whether to approach. And then came the small openings. A girl named Marta dropped her laundry pail near the fence, and one of the cowboys stepped forward instinctively, hand outstretched. The guards didn't stop him. Their fingers brushed for a second as he handed it back. Marta looked at him with a flash of something dangerously close to gratitude. He tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said, and walked away. She stood there, heart pounding, unsure what had just happened. Some of the men were simply curious. Others were lonelier than they'd admit. They'd returned from the war to find their towns hollowed out or unchanged in all the worst ways. The German women, with their quiet manners and haunted eyes, stirred something in them that wasn't pity, but recognition. Not one of these men had expected to feel drawn toward someone they had been taught to hate. And the women, for all their fear, could not help but notice the way these strangers looked at them. Not as trophies or prisoners, but as people. Each visit left the women more unsteady. They still flinched at loud sounds, still woke in the night sweating from dreams of air raids and sirens. But during the day, their eyes lingered at the fence, waiting. Not for freedom, not yet, but for something they couldn't name. One morning, as a cowboy named Thomas stood quietly with a sketch pad, drawing the distant hills beyond the camp, a woman named Liese walked slowly to the fence. She didn't speak. She just stood beside him, watching the same hills, the silence between them humming with something fragile. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the start of a different kind of war. One fought not with bombs, but with glances, with patience, with the terrifying possibility of being understood. It began with a crumpled piece of paper passed through the wire. The note was written in rough German, every word shaped by an English speaker's awkward hand. "You like horses?" it said. No signature, just a small drawing of a saddle and a question mark. Lotta, the woman who received it, stared at the note for a long time before folding it into her pocket. She didn't know who had written it. Later that week, she noticed one of the cowboys standing farther back than usual, pretending not to look her way. She smiled only slightly and looked away before he could see. It was safer that way. Soon the small gestures multiplied. A dictionary passed through a gap in the fence, wrapped in a bandana. A photograph of a baby boy, propped up in a soldier's wallet, held out wordlessly to a woman who reminded him of someone he once knew in Belgium. A square of gingham fabric, pressed and folded, left on the canteen counter as a kind of gift. It wasn't language they were speaking. It was something older. Gesture, recognition, a kind of unspoken truce made one moment at a time. Laughter came next, hesitant and rare. One morning during cleanup duty, a cowboy named Jake tried to say Guten Morgen and ended up saying something closer to goat morning. A ripple of giggles spread through the women hanging sheets nearby. One of them, Ing, mimed a goat bleating, and even the guard on watch cracked a smile. That evening, Jake brought a small notebook where he'd written down German phrases he didn't understand. "Ich bin müde," one line read. "I am tired." He pointed to it, then yawned exaggeratedly. Inge rolled her eyes but laughed again. It was the first time since Dresden that her face had felt light. Cultural misunderstandings became unexpected gifts. The cowboys, used to women who chewed gum and danced to swing records, found themselves fumbling for conversation with women who had learned silence as survival. The German women, raised on duty and sacrifice, were confused by men who called them ma'am and offered them flowers without asking for anything in return. When one cowboy asked Lotta if she liked pie, she blinked, unsure whether he meant goodbye or a strange new insult. Later, she saw him in town holding an actual pie box. She burst into laughter so loud that two guards turned to look. The women began to write letters again. Some wrote home to Germany, carefully avoiding mention of the Americans, describing only the food, the chores, the quiet. Others wrote letters they never sent, folded confessions in broken English tucked beneath mattresses. A few shared them with each other, trading phrases like secrets. One read, "He has eyes like the river. I do not know what this means, but I dream of them." The fence, once a line of fear, became something stranger, a place of ritual. They gathered there without planning to, drawn by something neither party fully understood. Sometimes the men brought radios, turning the knobs until jazz drifted through the air. Sometimes the women brought paper cranes, folded from canteen receipts and tossed them over with a grin. There was no plan, no destination, just something growing where nothing was meant to grow. One evening, a cowboy named Henry pressed a photograph of his sister into Lisa's hand. "She don't smile in pictures," he said softly. "You remind me of her." Lisa looked down at the photo, then at him, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to wonder what it might mean to be seen without being judged, without being feared, without being used. It was a dangerous thought, one she couldn't afford to trust, but she didn't throw the photo away. She tucked it beneath her pillow and dreamed that night of warm bread, of open fields, of someone humming a song she didn't know the words to, but somehow understood. Love hadn't arrived yet, but its shadow had begun to stretch across the dust and wire, long and quiet and irreversible. It didn't take long before that shadow was noticed. The camp had rules, sharp, printed, and unyielding. No contact beyond official duties, no passing of notes, no gestures across the fence, no speaking beyond supervised moments. These were not suggestions. They were laws of containment, but hearts like weeds in sidewalk cracks grew where they weren't supposed to. Even barbed wire couldn't stop them. The officers knew it. The guards saw it. Some turned away, others scowled, boots striking the dirt with extra force during patrol. "No mingling," one of them said flatly, catching a woman too close to the edge. "Next time, you go to another camp." And some did. One morning, without warning, Lotta was told to pack her things. She'd been seen too many times too close to the fence, too often laughing at words she shouldn't have heard. She didn't cry. She folded her meager belongings, placed the small dictionary in the middle of the bundle, and walked to the waiting truck without a word. On the other side of the wire, the cowboy who had once drawn her a picture stood watching. He didn't wave. She didn't turn around. But something passed between them all the same. The ache of something too fragile to name, now shattered. For those who remained, the rules began to take on strange shapes. Some guards enforced them to the letter, reporting even glances. Others offered space, stepping away just long enough for silence to become dialogue. The American authorities knew relationships were forming, but they preferred to contain rather than confront. As long as it remained quiet, invisible, they could pretend it wasn't happening. But invisible things have weight, and that weight began to pull. Every exchange became a risk. A note slipped into a work glove, a chocolate bar left on a laundry cart, a word spoken too softly, too kindly. When a soldier named Jack gave a woman named Hilda a ribbon, red torn from the inside of his coat, it was meant as a joke. "For your hair," he'd said, blushing. Hilda wore it the next morning, and by midday she was gone, reassigned, transferred. The ribbon left behind on her bunk like a warning. Still, it didn't stop. The heart rarely listens to the mind and never to authority. For every couple torn apart, another found a new way to speak. They met in shadows during supply runs, during chapel services. A nod became a conversation, a shared prayer, a form of confession. At night, women whispered in their bunks about hands that had touched theirs, eyes that had lingered too long. "What if we just left?" one asked. "Walked through the gate and didn't look back." The others shook their heads, but none of them said no. The risk grew heavier as feelings deepened. A guard caught writing a letter for one of the women, helping her craft a message home, was disciplined and reassigned. Another who had shared a cigarette behind the kitchen was warned officially. But what could punishment do to men who had already survived Europe's worst battlefields? What could rules mean to women who had lost everything? Love, when it appeared, was not a rebellion. It was a rescue. The fantasy began to grow, not of escape, but of belonging. Some women imagined a house with a porch, a field with real grass, a table where supper was eaten slowly instead of hoarded in fear. The men, in turn, dreamed of laughter that wasn't haunted, of eyes that didn't flinch. And so they kept pushing against the rules, not with force, but with stubborn, aching hope. Every smile was a risk, every note a rebellion, but none of them stopped. Because what they'd found, across language, pain, and propaganda, was something more powerful than orders. It was the belief that maybe, just maybe, the war hadn't stolen everything. Not yet. Not if they could still look at each other and see a future. That fragile future took shape on a warm spring morning when Samuel pressed a folded paper into Greta's hand behind the canteen. No words. Just his name, hers, and a question. "Would you marry me?" Her fingers closed around it like it might vanish. She didn't answer right away. For hours, she kept the paper hidden in her sleeve, afraid to look at it again. But when she finally unfolded it beneath the flickering light of the barracks, something opened in her chest. Not hope, not yet. Just breath. A breath she hadn't let herself take in years. It wasn't simple. Nothing ever was. Greta was still a prisoner. Samuel was still a cowboy with scars on his hands and a war behind his eyes. The camp rules hadn't changed, but the world outside had. Peace had been declared. The fences remained, but the future was shifting. Greta spoke to Anna first. They sat on the edge of their bunks, whispering. Anna's hands were stained with soap from the laundry. "You trust him?" she asked. Greta nodded. "I don't know why, but yes." Anna looked at her, long and quiet, then said, "Then do it." The War Brides Act didn't technically cover women like Greta, POWs, former auxiliaries of the Reich. But in towns like Fort Reno and Huntsville, lines blurred. Chaplains, sheriffs, even camp officials had begun to look the other way. Love wasn't supposed to happen behind barbed wire, and yet it had. Greta and Samuel filled out forms, signed their names carefully, and waited. The chaplain agreed to perform the ceremony. One of the guards brought her a dress from his sister's closet. Plain white cotton, worn at the cuffs. Greta wept when she tried it on. The wedding took place just beyond the camp gates, in a chapel that smelled of dust and cedar. Anna stood at her side, holding a sprig of wildflowers tied with a ribbon. Lotta and Inge watched from the second pew, their hands folded tight in their laps. Samuel stood at the front, hat in hand, boots newly polished. He looked terrified. Greta walked slowly down the aisle, her breath shallow, her heart a drumbeat in her throat. The priest spoke gently, his words soft as the breeze through the windows. When it came time for vows, Greta faltered. Her voice broke. The room held its breath. "Do you want to stop?" the priest asked. Greta looked at Samuel, his face, his calloused hands, his quiet eyes, and shook her head. "No," she whispered. "I never thought I'd be loved again." Afterward, they stood in the dirt outside the chapel, blinking in the afternoon light. There was no reception, just a kiss, a hug from Anna, a few awkward claps from the guards who had watched them fall in love through fence lines. One soldier, the same who once handed Greta her first bar of soap, gave her a nod and said, "You made it." Back in the barracks that night, Greta placed her wedding band beside her diary, where her oldest entry still read, "I think I am being taken to die." Now she added a new line beneath it. "Today I was married in a country I was raised to hate." She let the pen rest on the page, unsure if either sentence made sense. Anna sat beside her, silent. She didn't speak of the war or of the future. She just held Greta's hand as the night settled in. Outside, the fences still glinted in the moonlight, but somehow they no longer seemed so tall. The air smelled of earth and promise. And for the first time since crossing the Atlantic, Greta didn't feel like she was waiting for her life to return. She felt like it had just begun. The wedding band on Greta's finger was too loose. Samuel promised to have it resized, but in the meantime, she slipped it onto a chain and wore it beneath her collar. Each morning, she woke to the sound of roosters and the groan of wooden floors. The war had taken cities from her, and now the plains gave her silence. Too much silence sometimes. She had traded rubble for wide sky, but her hands still moved like a prisoner's. Quick, careful, invisible. On their first day in the farmhouse, she folded Samuel's shirts and placed them in neat stacks with military precision. When he noticed, he didn't comment. He just touched her shoulder lightly, then left her to it. Life on the land was not easy. There were no neighbors close enough to visit without a truck, and the road was more dust than gravel. Greta learned to cook over a stove that burned hotter than she was used to, using ingredients she didn't recognize. Cornmeal, molasses, canned green beans. She burned everything for a week. The first time she managed a decent stew, Samuel kissed her cheek and said, "Tastes like home." Greta didn't ask whose home he meant. Outside, she helped feed the chickens, scatter hay, and haul buckets from the well when the tap ran dry. Her boots blistered her feet. Her back ached from carrying pails. But none of that compared to the ache inside. The ache of knowing that somewhere across the ocean, her mother was probably digging for roots between ruins. Her brother, if still alive, was maybe standing in bread lines or worse. She hadn't received a letter in months. And here she was, married, warm, fed, to an American. The guilt came in waves. She would be laughing at something Samuel said, then go silent mid-breath, remembering the black snow in Munich and the screams in the rubble. Sometimes at night she would sing to herself, old German lullabies she hadn't dared hum in the camps. Once Samuel heard her and asked what the song meant. She lied and said it was nothing. She couldn't bear to tell him it was the one her mother used to sing during air raids. People in town stared. Not all, but enough. In the general store, a woman muttered under her breath when she heard Greta's accent. A man once asked Samuel, "You sure about her?" Samuel didn't reply. But that night, he came home and sat on the porch longer than usual, staring into the dark without saying a word. Greta didn't ask what was wrong. She just brought him coffee and sat beside him, both of them holding their silence like an offering. Anna wrote once, a letter smuggled through someone still working at the camp. She had not married, but she was working in the laundry still, saving money. "Some days I forget I was ever part of the war," she wrote. "Other days it lives in my skin." Greta read the letter 3 times. She folded it neatly and tucked it beside her Bible. The days grew into weeks. Greta began to plant a garden. Tomatoes, beans, onions. She knelt in the dirt and let the soil get under her nails, felt the sun sting her neck. She began to hum while she worked. Sometimes she caught Samuel watching her from the porch. He didn't interrupt. He just watched, as if seeing her become someone he hadn't quite met yet. She missed Germany, but not the Reich. She missed the sound of her language spoken in the streets, but not the orders barked in it. She missed her family, but not the life they'd been forced to live. She didn't know what that made her. Traitor, survivor, ghost. But each morning she woke in her own bed, in a house where no boots marched, where no sirens screamed, and she let herself believe, just for a moment, that healing might not mean forgetting, only learning how to live with the remembering. Years later, Greta still folded Samuel's shirts the same way they taught her in the camp. Two creases sharp and clean, sleeves tucked tight beneath. It was habit, maybe. Or maybe it was the only way she knew how to keep control. She never explained it, just as she never explained the tiny box she kept in the dresser drawer. Inside was a sliver of white soap, dried and cracked. She hadn't used it. She never would. It was the first bar she'd received in the American delousing station, the one that smelled faintly of flowers and stunned her into tears. Samuel had once asked why she kept it. "Because it was the first time I felt human again," she'd nearly said, but instead she shrugged. Just a memory. There were many such memories she never shared. Most of the women didn't. Some, like Lotta, married and moved to other towns. Some stayed single. Others left America altogether. But whether they built lives on ranches or in city apartments, none of them truly left the camps behind. Greta never told her children she had once slept on a cot behind barbed wire. She never mentioned the hunger or the whispers or the terrifying gentleness of those early American mornings. She simply told them, "Mama came from Germany a long time ago." She stopped speaking German sometime in the early 50s. At first it was small, choosing English at the store, at church, with neighbors. Then she stopped even at home. It became too hard to explain why a word would slip out that tasted like ash or snow or grief. Her lullabies shifted from the ones her mother sang to the ones she heard on American radio. And when her son asked once if she remembered any of the old songs, she smiled and shook her head. "They're gone," she said. But they weren't. Not really. In her closet hung a coat she hadn't worn since arriving in America. Thick wool, dyed gray-green, the one she'd been issued as an auxiliary before surrender. She'd meant to throw it away, or burn it, or bury it under time. But she never did. Once a year, when the house was quiet and Samuel had gone into town, she would slip it on, just for a moment. It no longer fit, but the weight of it reminded her. Anna wrote letters for years, and Greta kept them all tied with ribbon in the attic. In one, Anna wrote, "Sometimes I think we were part of something no one will believe, and sometimes I think we weren't supposed to survive it at all." Greta read that line again and again. She never answered. Some silences were safer. Neighbors knew her as kind, quiet, dependable. She brought pies to church picnics, helped with school events, smiled politely when others talked about the war, as if it were only a film they had watched. Sometimes, though, when fireworks cracked across the July sky, she would stiffen, her body curling slightly inward. Her daughter once asked why she didn't like firecrackers. "Too loud," she said. "Too sudden." The war lived in her rituals, in how she hoarded thread and buttons in a tin can, in how she never wasted a slice of bread, in how she folded the ends of soap bars into new ones so that nothing was lost. These were not signs of fear, but of memory, of how close she had once been to losing everything. She loved Samuel, not blindly, not without difficulty, but with a quiet steadiness that had grown from the moment he handed her a piece of paper and asked her to choose. He never asked her to explain what came before. She never asked him what he had seen in Europe. It was an unspoken agreement that their past could sit quietly in the corners of their home, like shadows that didn't need to speak to be known. And so Greta lived, not as a war bride or a refugee, not as a prisoner or a traitor, but as a woman who had chosen, once, to say yes. The gravel road behind the camp was long gone, grown over with weeds and time. But sometimes when the wind blew just right, She could still hear her boots crunching on the stones, and she would pause just for a second to remember the sound. It was summer when Greta returned to Germany. The air smelled of asphalt and bakeries, not rubble and ash. She stepped off the train in Munich with Samuel beside her and a leather purse pressed to her side, fingers wrapped tight around the handle like a lifeline. She had not spoken her native language aloud in years. It returned slowly, syllables blooming in her mouth like forgotten seeds. The station had been rebuilt. Glass ceilings, polished floors, no guards, no boots. Only the hum of announcements and the shuffle of modern life. They stayed in a modest hotel on the edge of the city. The street was lined with trees now, but Greta remembered it differently. She stood at the corner where the bakery once burned and stared at the spot where her brother had carried her on his shoulders during their last winter together. Nothing remained of that world except the echo inside her chest. Samuel watched her from a distance, knowing not to ask. Some things could not be explained, only endured. Later they visited the church where she'd been baptized. It still stood, though the stained glass was new. Inside she lit a candle and didn't say a word. Her knees ached as she knelt, and for a moment she wasn't a visitor or a survivor. She was a girl again, hearing the choir through cracked windows, smelling wax and dust. And then the image shifted. Barbed wire, the clang of trays, the soap in her hand, and she opened her eyes, blinking against tears she didn't let fall. Back at the hotel, she sat on the balcony and watched the city move around her. The people, the traffic, the children laughing. It all felt real and unreal at once. "It's so clean now," she whispered to Samuel, who nodded. "You rebuilt it," he said gently. "All of you." Greta shook her head. "We survived it. That's different." At dinner, she tasted rye bread and apple cake and felt memories flood her senses. The hollow hunger of war, the bitterness of rationed coffee, the guilt of abundance. She closed her eyes and let it pass. She was not here to reclaim what had been lost, only to witness that it had once been hers. The next day they visited the cemetery. She didn't know if any of her family were buried there. The records were gone, the names uncertain, but she laid down a single flower anyway. "For all of them," she said. Samuel held her hand, rough and steady, and for a moment she leaned into him, not as a wife, but as a woman who had made 1,000 quiet choices and survived each one. On their last night, they walked by the river. The lights reflected in the water, soft and golden. Greta paused on the bridge and looked out over the current. "I never wanted to come back," she said, "and now that I have, I think I can finally go home." Samuel didn't answer. He didn't need to. They returned to America with souvenirs and photographs, but the real keepsake was quieter. The sense that what had once been broken could be remembered without reopening the wound. Greta placed a photo of the Munich church beside the one of their wedding day. In both, she wore the same expression, uncertain, solemn, alive. She never spoke about the camp in detail, not even now. But sometimes when her granddaughter asked why she saved every scrap of fabric or folded napkins so precisely, she would smile and say, "It's just something I learned a long time ago." In the end, she understood that liberation had not come with a key or a flag. It had come with a bar of soap, a cowboy's quiet kindness, and the unthinkable act of saying yes. She had surrendered to something far more dangerous than defeat, tenderness. And in doing so, she had found the one thing the war could not destroy, the right to begin again on her own terms.